Hi everyone, my name's Tracy. This is Martina.
Hi.
Welcome to Natural Shores Retail Nursery. We're here again today to do another NST book club. Today we're talking about Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. This one is kind of like the conservation, environmental movement's Bible, I want to say. I mean, if although Leopold is the father of conservation, then definitely Rachel Carson would be the mother of this grassroots movement that happened in the 60s, where she wrote this book that detailed a lot of negative effects of pesticides in our environment. And I think it's safe to say a lot of us in this field have read this book and kind of have it in our libraries. And what really hits me about this book is that it could be written today about what's going on in our environment, just like it could, just like in the 60s. There's so much that applies now to the chemicals we're putting into our environment, and so that was one huge takeaway I took from this book.
Sure.
What do you think, Martina?
Well, something she really brought home was that chemicals are not adapted with life on Earth. So life has not developed with these new chemicals. Life has developed over tens of thousands of years, and just in the last 60 to 70 years we've introduced these chemicals and
The synthetic chemicals,
Yep.
like lab-made chemicals.
Yes.
The whole world is
Non-organic.
made of chemicals, but these specifically are made by mankind to
Yep.
be put into the environment it wasn't evolved to
Yep.
deal with. So, yeah.
Yeah, she lists or gives a lot of examples, real life examples that were happening during the time of the 50s and 60s, and it was really tragic. I mean, in the first couple of chapters, even the headings,
Are very dramatic.
yep, and as they should be. I mean,
Right.
It's pretty terrible stuff. I mean, she does have really cool illustrations at the beginning of each chapter, which are kind of fun to look at, and they all deal with what she's going to be talking about in the chapter. But yeah, lots of examples.
Real life examples of just a lot of different species dying outright from chemicals that are still used today, like 2,4-D in a lot of situations, agriculturally and also in other uses, which I was really surprised about. I mean, I thought this book was mostly about DDT, but there's a lot of, which is not used anymore in the United States, but there's a lot of other chemicals that I'm reading through this book and recognizing that are still used today. And it's very surprising to me because the examples she gives are just of whole populations of robins and other birds just dying horrible deaths from chemical toxicity. So that was a little bit scary. Like you said before, there's a lot of chapters one's called Rivers of Death. So it is a kind of a scary book.
For sure. Yeah, she mentions in nature nothing exists alone. So everything that we put out into the world, it's going to come back in some form. Like for example, soil exists in a constant state of change through all the processes and cycles. It just it's like a wheel, it keeps going around and around. And once you introduce something that is not usually found in it, such as inorganic chemicals, I mean, that can really have a strong effect and a negative effect on the soil.
And that just kind of takes a cascading effect through the trophic levels.
Yes.
It never just, one takeaway I had too is it never just affects the thing you're targeting.
For sure.
It affects a lot of other things throughout the food web, and it also bioaccumulates through the web. So if it starts off affecting the plankton, and it'll be 10 times or 50 times worse in the next step up, and then it just keeps accumulating as it goes up. So the predators at the top of the food chain can really
Get the biggest dose.
Yeah, so that's very scary.
Yeah. One thing I found very interesting is that she mentions herbivores are more attracted to wilting plants despite their palatability. So once you spray that chemical on that plant, an herbivore might come by and say, "Oh, this is a wilting plant." I'm not sure if it has to do with the nutritional content of the plant, but even plants they usually wouldn't eat. Carson mentions that she has observed, or other people observing those animals eating those plants that have been sprayed.
Yeah, I think they mentioned something about the sugars start building up in
Yeah.
it as it starts to die, and that attracts the herbivores, I don't know, by smell or something. But yeah, that's really scary too. So a lot of cattle that they were spraying specific weeds to get out of their foraging pastures, and then the cattle started going for those weeds that they sprayed, even though before they weren't eating them. So that is concerning to me. And she also talked a lot about how in the 60s they used to spray all the roadsides, and that's something that I'm seeing a little bit more today too, where we're trying to push back weeds or shrubs that are along the roadsides, but once you kill the native stuff, then invasive things come in and fill that gap.
For
so
sure.
You're kind of creating a problem where there might not have been a problem before, where you could have just maybe mowed and not so much sprayed.
Yeah.
Because then invasive species or something worse always tries to kind of fill that gap. I also was really scared to read that she talks about Japanese beetles and red ants and a bunch of other things that people were spraying for back in the 60s, trying to eradicate those. And we know now today that clearly didn't work, because there's Japanese beetles everywhere. But in those attempts to kill Japanese beetles, they killed so many other species.
Right.
Terribly harmed a lot of really delicate populations of birds, and that's kind of where the title of the book comes from, I think, is where no birds were like people who are used to hearing their birds sing and would put out bird feeders to attract birds. They would find them dead on their lawn, or they wouldn't find any birds the following year, or just kind of instantaneously within days of these chemicals being sprayed, it was just silent. And that's very kind of alarming. I think we take it for granted, all the birds that are singing, and
We hear some right now.
yeah. And just to kind of live in a world where it's silent is very concerning to me, and kind of we're in the thick of it still today, where there's neonicotinoids out there that are harming our bee populations. There's other chemicals that the sellers might say are safe to use around people and pets and everything else, but it's something that we really need to do more research on, and
For sure.
not blanket them from the sky.
Yeah.
Like there was a couple of chapters about airplanes flying over and spraying people. Didn't you say something about them spraying people too for?
Yeah, so for diseases like such as malaria, they would actually sprinkle granules on people, and
To kill.
that's not good.
Yeah.
But then again, I mean, they didn't have the research available. There was actually a lot less funding. I think it was like close to like 1% of the funding for the chemical development. So they didn't have like really any designation for research. They just had it all for chemicals, and it really was for the business industry to try to get that money. It's pretty sad. So yeah, she also in the last few chapters, of course, discusses the health effects, because of course we as humans are not apart from nature. These chemicals, these inorganic chemicals, also harm us because they harm all life, all the biological life surrounding us. And she mentions how they damage our livers and react in our bodies with other chemicals that we have in our bodies, which can make them even more dangerous. She just gets really detailed with the health effects and discussing how they interact in our body.
they find these chemicals in breast milk and in tissues that have nothing to do really with the digestion or respiratory tract. So it's found in our bodies, even if in chemicals that aren't used as much today are still found in populations of birds and other animals. It's pretty scary how this stuff does stay in the environment too after, it has a residual effect and all that. But yeah, it's a great book, super awesome. I recommend everyone to read it. I hope we did Rachel some justice. She died actually of cancer shortly after writing the book, and her legacy is very important. She, there's an afterword in this one about E.O. Wilson, or from E.O. Wilson, and he talks about how a lot of the scientists knew about all this, but they couldn't really reach the public very well and kind of spread the word. And she did a great job of writing this book, letting the public know, and starting a grassroots campaign to really bring this whole environmental movement, started on its way to where we are today. And I think the EPA was created after her book, so her legacy is super important, and this book is still relevant today. So go out there, read it if you haven't read it already, read it again if you've already read it, and
read it a third time.
Yeah, and be careful with those chemicals you're using on your lawn. And yeah, we'll
Just
see you.
Be more aware.
Yep, be aware, do your research, and read the book. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time.